In the previous chapter, you learned how ownership of property is conveyed, recorded, and insured to ensure clear and marketable title. In this chapter, we shift our focus from ownership to possession and use, the world of leasing. A lease defines the relationship between landlords and tenants, combining the legal principles of conveyance and contract. Understanding how leases function, their essential clauses, types, defaults, and the governing landlord-tenant laws is fundamental to competent real estate practice. The lease contract. A lease is both an instrument of conveyance and a contract between the landlord-lessor and the tenant-lessee. As a conveyance, it transfers a possessory interest, called a leasehold estate, that gives the tenant exclusive use and occupancy for a defined term. However, the landlord retains legal title. For this reason, leasehold estates are also known as less than freehold estates. The four basic leasehold estates are estate for years, fixed beginning and ending dates, ends automatically. Periodic tenancy renews automatically until either party gives notice. Estate at will continues indefinitely until either party ends it. Estate at sufferance arises when a tenant holds over without consent after the lease expires. Although the tenant gains exclusive possession, leases often impose restrictions on use, repairs, and alterations. Commercial leases, for example, may limit storage of hazardous materials or require compliance with zoning and signage rules. A lease becomes binding once both parties agree and communicate acceptance. Recording is not required for validity but can provide public notice in long-term or high-value leases. If either party dies during the lease usually survives. The tenant's estate or the landlord's heirs must honor the agreement. When property is sold, the buyer takes title subject to existing leases, becoming the new landlord. Rights and obligations. When tenants sign a lease, they acquire the rights of exclusive possession, quiet enjoyment, lawful use, and profit from lawful activities such as subletting, if allowed. In exchange, they must pay rent, maintain the premises, and comply with lawful rules. The landlord holds a leased fee estate, the right to receive rent and regain possession at the end of the term. Landlords must provide safe, habitable premises, maintain common areas, and respect tenant privacy. Arizona law emphasizes habitability and safety in all residential leases, requiring essential services such as water, heat, and cooling. Requirements for a valid lease. A lease, like any contract, must satisfy essential elements. Competent parties, both must have legal capacity. Property description identifies the premises by address or legal description. Exclusive possession grants the tenant use during the term. Legal purpose, the use must be lawful. Consideration, usually rent or another payment. Offer and acceptance, both must agree to identical terms. Signatures, landlord must sign. Tenants should sign for enforceability. Writing requirement, under the statute of frauds, any lease longer than 1 year must be in writing. Oral long-term leases are unenforceable and treated as tenancies at will. Essential lease clauses. A well-drafted lease defines all key expectations. Rent and security deposit specifies the amount, due date, grace period, penalties, and deposit terms. Arizona limits deposits to 1.5 months' rent, excluding first month rent, and requires refunds or itemized deductions within 14 days after move-out. Repairs and maintenance describes responsibilities. Tenants handle routine upkeep. Landlords handle structural or major repairs unless otherwise agreed. Subletting and assignment. Subletting transfers part of the leasehold. Assignment transfers all of it. Landlords usually require written approval. Improvements and alterations determine whether changes may be made and who owns them at lease end. Commercial tenants often negotiate removal or depreciation rights. Options and renewals give tenants choices to renew, expand, or purchase the property if conditions are met. Damage and destruction explains rights if the property becomes unusable. Arizona law permits termination or rent abatement when premises are uninhabitable. These clauses protect both parties by clarifying obligations and remedies long before disputes arise. Types of leases. Different lease forms allocate expenses and risks differently. Gross lease, full service. Landlord pays property expenses, such as taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Tenant pays fixed rent. Common in apartments and office suites, where tenants prefer predictable costs. Net lease. Tenant pays base rent plus some or all expenses. Single net, N. Tenant pays taxes. Double net, NN. Tenant pays taxes and insurance. Triple net, NNN. Tenant pays taxes, insurance, and maintenance. These are prevalent in commercial and industrial properties. Percentage lease, used in retail. Tenant pays base rent plus a percentage of gross sales. Aligns the landlord's income with the tenant's business success. Residential lease. Short-term, usually gross, standardized for compliance with landlord-tenant law. Landlords maintain habitability, tenants pay rent and utilities. Commercial lease, highly negotiable, long-term, often combining gross and net features. Addresses tenant improvements, default remedies, and renewal rights. Ground lease, tenant leases only the land, builds improvements, and pays rent on the land. Typically 30 to 50 years long, allowing recovery of construction costs. When the term ends, improvements usually revert to the landowner. Proprietary lease, used in cooperatives. The tenant is also a shareholder in the corporation owning the property and pays a proportionate share of building expenses rather than rent. Leasing of rights. Sometimes only specific rights, air, water, or mineral rights, are leased rather than possession of land or buildings. Defaults and termination. Because leases are contracts, failure to perform obligations constitutes default. Typical tenant defaults include non-payment of rent or property damage. Landlords must provide notice and an opportunity to cure before filing an action for possession. In Arizona, landlords must store abandoned property for 14 days before disposal or sale. Landlord defaults usually involve failure to maintain habitability or provide essential services. If conditions become intolerable and the tenant vacates, it is known as constructive eviction. Leases terminate by expiration of term, proper notice in periodic tenancies, mutual agreement, destruction, condemnation, foreclosure, or abandonment. Sale of the property does not terminate a valid lease. The buyer becomes the new landlord. Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, URLTA. The Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, URLTA, was created to balance the rights of landlords and tenants through fair, standardized rules. It regulates lease creation, deposits, obligations, access, default, and eviction. Key principles include: leases must be clear and written, deposits cannot exceed 1.5 months' rent, non-refundable fees must be labeled as such in writing. Landlords must maintain habitability and provide essential services. Tenants must pay rent, keep premises clean, and act in good faith. Landlords must give 48 hours notice before entry except in emergencies. Evictions must follow due process procedures. Self-help lockouts are prohibited. Arizona's Residential Landlord and Tenant Act mirrors these standards with additional state-specific rules, such as allowing tenants to make minor repairs up to $300 and deduct the cost from rent after notice. Review summary. A lease transfers the right to possess property without conveying ownership. It merges property law and contract law to govern the rights and obligations of landlords and tenants. Lease validity requires competent parties, consideration, lawful purpose, and, if longer than 1 year, a written agreement. Leases vary from gross and net to percentage, ground, and proprietary forms, each balancing expenses differently. Defaults are resolved through notice and lawful remedies, while termination follows expiration, agreement, or law. Finally, the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act ensures fairness, transparency, and habitability in residential leasing, forming the legal backbone of modern rental housing in Arizona and nationwide. Discussion. Why must a lease over 1 year be in writing to be enforceable? Because the Statute of Frauds requires certain long-term contracts to be written to prevent fraud and ensure certainty. How does subletting differ from assigning a lease? Subletting transfers part of the term. Assignment transfers the entire interest and responsibility. Why is quiet enjoyment essential to tenants? It guarantees undisturbed use of the premises and freedom from interference by the landlord or third parties with superior claims. How can a ground lease benefit both landlord and tenant? The tenant gains use of valuable land without purchase, while the landlord earns rent and retains ownership of appreciating land. What happens when a property is sold during an active lease? The buyer takes title subject to the lease and must honor its terms.